What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with yet another discography ranking, and today I am finally bringing to you the long-awaited and highly anticipated ranking of all 20 studio full-length albums from New York, New Jersey thrash metal pioneers, Overkill. So yeah, this has been a ranking a lot of you guys have wanted me to do for a while, and I handpicked this one for the month of October because I thought, why not? Because this band deserves to have their history covered on the channel, as well as talking about their albums and seeing how I feel about them. So yeah, this is going to be a fun one. Granted, this next to Black Sabbath were the two biggest discographies I have done rankings for thus far in terms of the amount of work. So yeah, it took a little while to get through all 20 of these albums, but it was well worth it, and there you have it. As far as how I got into Overkill, basically this was a little bit after I got into the initial thrash bands. Like, of course, I was already into Metallica and Megadeth by the time my pre-teens came around, but by the time I got to being a teenager in middle school, I eventually discovered bands like Exodus, Testament, bands along those lines. Overkill didn't come into the picture until a little bit after, like in high school. And The Years of Decay was the first album I ever checked out from this band. And ever since then, I've followed up with them in terms of their more recent output, starting with White Devil Armory. And ever since then, I've been checking out their stuff. I even reviewed the last two albums on the channel. So, of course, I didn't give the entire discography a shot until doing this ranking, because you can basically say this band has had three distinct eras in their career. So I will go ahead and flat out say it. There is not an album in this discography I would say is bad or that I dislike. It's just, this band has been grossly consistent their entire career, so this ranking was actually a little bit difficult, especially in the bottom half. So, with all that being said, let's get into the history of Overkill. So, the origins of the band would start out initially with bassist Carlo D.D. Verney and drummer Lee Kundrad, otherwise known as Rat Skates. They initially had a punk band called the Lubricants, which, by the way, thumbs up for the name. That is clever and highly appropriate for a punk band. But they placed an ad for a vocalist and guitarist in which it would be answered by guitarist Robert Pisaric, otherwise known as Riff Thunder, and vocalist Bobby Blitz Ellsworth. So the four would hook up in 1980 and originally call the band Virgin Killer, but later in the year they would change the name to Overkill, named after the Motorhead song, Overkill. So the band would just start out playing cover songs of some of their big heroes like Motorhead, Judas Priest, Riot, Dead Boys, Ramones. Kind of, again, sort of more like a punk band, just doing covers initially to kind of get the feel for the chemistry before they would eventually write original material later in the timeline. However, in 1981, Robert would be replaced by future Anthrax guitarist Dan Spitz. Now, Dan had a very brief stint in the band, as even later on in 1981, he would be replaced by Anthony Amendola. And then later in the year, Anthony would be replaced by a duo of guitarists by the names of Mike Sherry and Rich Conti. Then in 1982, both Mike and Rich would be replaced by a guitarist by the name of Joe. No last name, just Joe. However, later in 1982, Joe would be replaced by Bobby Gustafson, who would be in the band for the next almost decade. So finally, a lineup is solidified with Bobby, Dee Dee, Rat, and Bobby. So, two Bobbies, and Dee Dee and Rat. So, 1983 comes around, and they make their Power and Black demo, which is considered a legendary demo in the metal underground in its entire history. And the momentum from that demo carried on to them playing shows at like local places in the New York City, New Jersey area, especially up in Old Bridge, their stomping grounds. The Old Bridge Militia, a lot of people called that scene. However, in 1984, the momentum from their live shows as well as the demo would get them a record deal with Megaforce Records. So Megaforce was starting to build momentum ever since 1983 when Metallica signed to the label, and the momentum just kept growing and growing and growing to where Anthrax was on the label. Now we got Overkill on the label, and they would enter the studio in 1985 to record their debut full-length, and they would get Carl Kennedy to produce this album, and he had already done work with bands like Anthrax and Exciter, so definitely a good choice for the producer on the first album. But released October 15th, 1985, we would get their debut album, Feel the Fire. This one is my number 5 album. I love this debut. Granted, I didn't listen to the entire album until doing this ranking. Holy shit, this is a fiery debut for sure. Definitely the production has its quirks. I mean, it's 1985, still trying to figure out how to record proper thrash metal. And even by 1985, thrash metal was still kind of getting figured out as to what it actually is defined as, because even on this album, there's still a little bit of overlap with the emerging speed metal scene. So there's definitely some thrash and speed metal ideas going on here, but still killer album, all things considered. It was a phenomenal foundation for them with raw energy, and it was just a ton of fun. Some of the standouts would be the opening track, Raise the Dead. It was just an awesome way to make a statement. Rotten to the Core, which was actually one of their first hits, you could say. Hammerhead, just an awesome galloping barn burner with a lot of thrashy guitar. The title track, it's just another one of them galloping thrasher masterpieces. And then the song Overkill, which would be the first of a 5-part series for the foreseeable future. And this song just absolutely kicked ass. You also have a pretty good solid cover of the Dead Boys Sonic Reducer. And now I will say some of the transitions on the track Second Son were a little bit odd. But aside from that, this was almost a perfect debut for this band. And I would say it could be considered slightly underrated in terms of thrash metal debuts because, you know, a lot of the big ones get brought up in terms of what's the best thrash debut album of all time. I wouldn't sleep on Feel the Fire by Overkill. Like, this one was an awesome way for the band to really make an impact, and it certainly did. And that's why it is my number 5. So moving ahead, we would move on with more shows and more writing, rehearsing, and everything, and then they would return to the studio at the very end of 1986 to work on album number 2. Released in March, couldn't find the exact day, but March of 1987, we would get the follow-up, Taking Over. This one would feature Alex Perialis doing production, who had, up to this point, already done work with bands like Testament and Carnivore, so definitely another great choice for a producer for sure. This album, however, is my number 2. I've always loved this album, going back to when I was first getting into the band in high school. Definitely some songs off of this I picked up on. Yeah, definitely the production got better. The songs get more aggressive and heavier. Still get some of that speed metal overlap in their sound, but you still do get plenty of thrashy energy to it. The opening track, Deny the Cross, is one of my favorite Overkill songs. It's just this big, galloping D-beat, speed metal, nasty riff fest. Fear His Name, mostly a big triplet chugging stomp with epic gallops in the bridge. It was like almost like you took Black Sabbath and Iron Maiden and merged it with a thrash band. And that's how you get this track. Fatal If Swallowed, killer tribal intro and bass into awesome chugging riffs and then just full-on speed. In Union We Stand, another early hit for the band, and it's one of their more anthemic songs. You had like cool tremolos and groove stomps, but with a huge anthemic chorus. But then you get to one of my all-time favorite Overkill songs, the closer, Overkill 2, The Nightmare Continues. You could almost argue this is an early progressive thrash metal song, because there's a lot of changes going on this track in terms of like the mood, the atmosphere, the songwriting. Like, you could argue it's progressive, but it's very thrashy, and it almost sounds like something you would hear Metallica do around this time with how they were getting more dynamic in the songwriting. This album certainly got more dynamic in the songwriting, and all five, and really the whole album's killer, but those are the five standouts for my money. But yeah, longer songs, as like I said, songwriting kept improving at this point, and yeah, momentum was reeling in their favor at this point, and that is why this is my number 2. So, not long after Taking Over was released, Rat Skates would leave the band to focus on his family and eventually become a director and filmmaker. And he would be briefly replaced by a drummer by the name of Mark Archibald. I have no idea how you say that name, but he only lasted for a short time before he would be replaced by Bob Falk, otherwise known as Sid Falk, on drums. And Sid would be in the band for quite a while from this point until later in the timeline. They would get back to the studio in early 1988, so again, they were just really quick at getting back into the studio. Once again, Alex Perialis produces, and released July 5th of 1988, we get Under the Influence. This one does fall to my number 7 spot. It is a great album, don't get me wrong, but I think where this album falls in comparison to the first 2 albums is the production. The production didn't sound as strong as Taking Over, or hell, even as strong as Field of Fire, at least in my mind. It definitely has a more loose sound, which I can appreciate, but comparing it especially to Taking Over, where the production sounded thick and nasty, this one just kind of felt a little bit looser, almost like a crossover thrash album in terms of the sound. But songwriting-wise, they're getting faster. Like, they're definitely getting more proper thrash metal, not so much the big speed metal moments that you got on the first 2 albums. And also, I will admit, one thing in its favor in terms of production was the mix of the bass. The bass was definitely mixed better on this album than the first 2 albums. Dee Dee's tone is starting to come through more. As far as standouts, the song Shred, up to this point, was their fastest song. Like, it's almost German thrash metal levels of fast. The track Hello from the Gutter was another huge hit for them back in the late 80s, and it definitely shows off their love of Iron Maiden to the fullest. Drunken Wisdom, I actually love how this one goes a lot of different directions. Beautiful acoustic play into heavy chugs that feel more doom metal a little bit, and then it goes straight into full-on thrash. End of the line, you get some awesome like classic metal gallops, but triplet chugs and great melodic guitar work. And then the closer, Overkill 3, Under the Influence. Acoustic starred with guitars that build into just a D-beat ripper and a pretty clean guitar ending for sure that definitely added more atmosphere. So keeping the tradition going of the Overkill song series on this album, and it just kept on keeping on. But yeah, this album, and I love how it's like a tale of 2 halves. The first half, shorter songs, second half, longer songs. So it's like they were still kind of experimenting a little bit with songcraft. And while they produced a hell of an album, again, the reason it falls to number 7 is the production. But it's still an awesome album. So, moving ahead later in 1988, again, band momentum just keeps building and building and building throughout the year with big-time shows, doing some tours. But they would return to the studio in 1989. This time, they would actually get a big help in the production with one Terry Date coming in as producer. And 1989 was a big year for Terry Date because he would do this album as well as Dream Theater's debut and Soundgarden's Louder Than Love. So 1989 was a busy year for Terry Date for sure. And Terry Day would come in to produce this next one, and released October 13th, 1989. We would get their final album on, or actually no, we got one more after this. Their next to final album on Megaforce Records, we get the monumental Years of Decay. Going into this was my number one. Coming out of this, still my number one. I think this is the Overkill album, in my personal opinion, because this perfectly encompasses everything that they have already done and what they'll continue to do throughout the rest of the discography. Production, in my personal opinion, this is one of the best production jobs of their entire career. Terry Day did an amazing job. It's heavier than it's ever been up to this point. More dynamic songwriting. Like, we're getting all sorts of influences coming in. And the guitar tone, one of the best thrash metal guitar tones of the 80s. And in fact, this album was so huge in terms of sound and the songwriting that it inspired Dimebag Darrell from Pantera to go more into this direction and get Terry Day to do Cowboys from Hell. And funny enough, Dime would become very close friends with the guys from Overkill for the years to come. Standouts, I mean, the whole album's killer, but standouts for me, Time to Kill, the opening track, it's a ripper of a song with a doomy breakdown. Elimination, need I say more? It's probably their signature song, and it's still my favorite. Probably my other favorite on this album would be Playing with Spiders / Skull Crusher. This is where the album kind of brought in a little bit of doom metal into their sound, like more of that like Black Sabbath influence. Like, this song in particular feels like the perfect amalgamation of Black Sabbath and Metallica. Like, it's the best of both worlds. Like, most of the song is very doomy, but after the second chorus, you get, or I think it was the first chorus, you get it back into like thrash like Overkill does, but it definitely does have echoes of Metallica. The title track, Years of Decay, it's like a somber dirge, but it does have some more like classic metal riffs that show up. But the closer, Evil Never Dies, otherwise known as Overkill 4, vicious closer to this album that just brings it all into a perfect package. This, to me, is a perfect thrash metal album that does bring in some influence of doom, and it marries both styles perfectly. Like, the entire album is just a masterpiece, and that is why it was my easy number one. So, moving on from the Years of Decay, they start playing more shows. However, in 1990, Bobby Gustafson would leave the band, citing some issues with the others. He would be replaced by the duo of Merritt Gant and Bobby Cannavino on guitars. And they would go back to the studio in 1991. Once again, Terry Day as the producer. Now we get to the final album on Megaforce Records. Released September 3rd, 1991, we get Horrorscope. This is my number 3. I don't know if I like it more than the Years Decay. Well, I should say I don't. But I do love this album. This is... I remember I did an Instagram reel a while back about 1990s thrash metal albums, and people were complaining, how come you didn't have Overkill Horoscope on there? 2 reasons. 1, I didn't listen to the entire thing until the discography, and 2, I knew this ranking was on the docket, so I wanted to wait to give my opinion about it until I did the ranking. But yeah, this is an awesome follow-up to Years of Decay. I don't like it as much as the Years of Decay, but it's definitely up there amongst my favorite Overkill albums now. As this album definitely has a more modernized sound, and even in the feels of the songwriting, starting to get a bit modernized. Like, there's a little bit more groove coming in, but it doesn't sacrifice their thrash metal sound. In fact, you could almost look at this as a bit of a transitional album from where they were before on the previous era to where they were going on the next era. So this is like the perfect bridge between their classic stuff and what they would do for the next decade plus. But this album does feature an awesome cover of Edgar Winter's Frankenstein. That is an awesome cover. But in terms of standouts, Coma, you get these like eerie, sinister, clean melodies into just furious riffing and a nasty breakdown. Thanks for Nothing, heavier, nastier, faster in spots. The title track, it's pretty atmospheric before it gets into, well, what the band is about to become for a while, and that's groove metal. But man, they did it so well. Nice Day for a Funeral, chug, groove, sinister riffs, somber doom melodies, and then Solitude. That's a unique one because you get like clean doom melodies and they feel somber, almost like Ozzy Osbourne stuff. And it was just a nice way to bring everything to a close. So yeah, it's like you're getting more dynamics and some diverse songwriting, but it definitely does mark a transition in their sound. But still, killer album, my number 3. So moving on from there, a year after Horrorscope came out, 1992, Sid would leave the band and be replaced by Tim Millar, formerly of DRI, on drums, and he would remain in the band for quite a long time. In fact, as we get to a certain point, he would end up becoming the longest tenured drummer in their history. But after Horrorscope came out, the band would get signed to Atlantic Records. So they would finally get onto a major label years after the initial thrash boom, but they would eventually get on a major label after all this time. They would get back to the studio at the end of 1992, heading into 1993, and released March 9th, 1993, we would get I Hear Black. This one is my number 14. So we are now in the era of the band where they basically went more towards groove metal, still keeping some of the thrash in there, but definitely feels more like 65% groove metal, 35% thrash. And Alex Perialis returns as producer on this album, and yeah, definitely the groove metal bug came into them. But I will go ahead and say, in terms of the old school of thrash of the 80s that went into the groove metal route, Overkill was easily the best out of all of them. Better than Sacred Reich, better than Exodus. I would even argue better than Testament at times. But it definitely is a big drop-off from Horrorscope. I mean, it's going from 3 to 14, but still, this was actually a better album than I thought it would be. I saw some pretty harsh reviews on this one. I actually think for a thrash band that decided to go more towards groove metal, I thought they did a pretty solid job on this one. I actually thought this was pretty good. Definitely the guitar tone's heavier and definitely inspired by Pantera for sure, but it still does remain Overkill at its core. Standouts on here, I did have 5 standouts I enjoyed. Dreaming in Colombian. You still get some thrashy gallops and riffs on there. Feed My Head just gets real hefty and chuggy. My favorite on the album, Spiritual Void. Dare I say it's almost a stoner metal or sludge metal song like Sabbath. Weight of the World brings back a little bit of the early days of the speed metal style. And then Undying, a lot darker of a song. Like up to this point, probably the darkest song of their career. And then I will say there were a couple songs I wasn't keen on, like Shades of Grey was like an odd, bordering on alternative, and then Ghost Dance I felt was unneeded, but pretty much almost everything else I enjoyed. So yeah, I still think this is a pretty damn good album for going from thrash to groove metal, but it is my number 14 just because there's just a lot of albums I like more. Excuse me. Yeah, you're going to be seeing me drink a lot of water because this is a long one to go through. But anyways, moving ahead to 1994. So literally just a little over a year out from I Hear Black. 15 months to be exact. We get the release of their next album. And this would end up being their last album on Atlantic Records. And the band would produce this album themselves and released July 15th, 1994, we would get W.F.O, otherwise known as Wide Fucking Open. This one moved up to my number 13. I actually thought this was an improvement over I Hear Black as far as songwriting goes. Like, it definitely mixes that groove metal sound of I Hear Black, but mixes it with their thrash sound pretty much to like a perfect 50-50 mix. So this kind of goes back a little bit towards the vibe of Horrorscope, honestly. Like, this could have been Horrorscope Part 2 almost. Although I will say the big issue I have with this album is the mix. The guitar tone's a little bit thin, and it's way too bassy in the mix. Like, the bass almost completely overpowers the guitars. But as far as standouts, you get plenty of thrashy nods to tracks like Where It Hurts, Fast Junkie, and Supersonic Hate. Hell, even Supersonic Hate gets a little bit punky at times. Bastard Nation, almost like you're mixing everything they've done up to this point. You get clean melodies, grooves, and thrashy gallops. And then Gasoline Dream, it just goes from chug and groove into just ballsy speed. So, yeah, they were able to mix both sounds of their repertoire pretty much almost perfectly on this. Like, there wasn't a song I thought was bad. It's just the reason why this wasn't a little bit higher is because of the mix. But it's still, I think, a really good album. I'd say check it out if you haven't, and it is my number 13. So, moving ahead less than 2 years, the band would return to the studio once again, and also record label shift. They would go to CMC International Records for the next few albums, and they would actually get a pretty big name, in the production chair. They would get the legendary Chris Sangarides, who most people know as producing for Judas Priest. He would come in to produce this next album, and released March 5th, 1996, we would get The Killing Kind. This one falls to my number 17. This album is a bit odd, but it's still good. It's definitely got a more polished production. I will say it's not overproduced. It's still groove metal in spots, but there's still more thrash going on here. It's just, I will say, like, one song, or actually 2 songs in particular, The Morning After and Private Bleeding, or I think those were the same song. Just an odd song with piano and strings I felt didn't quite fit on here, but still some damn good tracks on here, like Battle, thrashy riffing, and it's gritty, it's got some chug to it, but you do have some weird yaz and like audio samples from Batman Returns, which I thought was funny but weird. The track Godlike, maybe the thrashiest song on the entire album. Burn You Down to Ashes, kind of like Skull Crusher Part 2. It's got like that Evil Sabbath doom, but mixed with groove and thrash. Boldface Pagan Stomp basically feels like a perfect amalgamation of thrash and groove. And then Feeding Frenzy, probably their best instrumental they've ever done. It's got killer bass work, and the rhythms are just wild. The riff work is insane. So yeah, this album, still good. It just falls because, again, there's just other albums I like more, and that's the way it goes sometimes. But it is my number 17. I actually skipped over something about The Killing Kind. Actually, a year before Killing Kind came out in 1995, both Merritt and Rob would end up being replaced by Sebastian Marino and Joe Como, which Sebastian was formerly in Anvil and Joe was formerly in Annihilator. So they would both come in to replace Rob and Merritt on guitars for The Killing Kind, and would be in the band for the next album. And, well, we move on to 1997, where they entered the studio and begin a on and off relationship with Colin Richardson doing the mixing. The band still mostly produces every album, but they'll get somebody in to help out with the mix, and Colin Richardson would step up. And released September 30th, 1997, we would get From the Underground and Below. This one was my number 18. And again, solid songs. Like, this is still a good album, but there are definitely a few issues with this. One, not a fan of the snare sound on here. Like, the snare sounds small. And also, like, Dee Dee's bass tone. Like, you hear his bass tone on a majority of the albums, you know it's Dee Dee Verney's tone. This one, the bass tone feels really, really small. Like the snare, it's just not strong at all. And then you have a couple of strange tracks like I'm Alright and Promises. I mean, Promises is a solid ballad, but it does feel a little out of place on here. But as far as songs I did like, the track It Lives, you get some great nasty machine gun riffs, but with mid-tempo fury. Long Time Dying, interesting, like cool, like twangy guitars, but heavy chug. Half Past Dead, you get some like Middle Eastern melodies before it goes into chugs, gallops, and a nice bass line. First Underground Commission on Termination, big thrasher of a song, and even the closer, Little Bit of Murder, nasty thrashy closers. So you did have a more thrashy tinge at the end, but you know, there's still some problems with it, mainly in the production that could have been fixed, and it might have went up a few spots. But still, good album nonetheless, my number 18. So we move on to later in 1998. We get an interesting incident that happens with one Bobby Blitz. So they were playing a show, I believe somewhere in Europe, I forget exactly where, but Bobby Blitz talked about this in an interview, that he was meeting fans and he met a woman who called herself a witch and started touching Bobby's face and then said to him, "You need to go to a doctor to get checked out." And Bobby didn't think much of it until a few months later. He noticed he had like a spot on his nose that was getting to be about the size of a pencil eraser, which led to a diagnosis of nose cancer, and which Bobby would go to have surgery to have the tumors removed. And all has been well with Bobby in terms of that ever since. He hasn't had another cancer scare like that ever since. But he always found it to be very strange that he got diagnosed by a witch by touching his face and saying that you need to get yourself checked out because you're sick. And then he noticed that this was getting bigger. So that kind of inspired the themes to a degree for this next album. They would return to the studio at the end of 1998. This time Andy Katz produces, and released February 23rd, 1999, we get Necroshine. This goes up to my number 12. I think in terms of the more groove metal era of this band, this was the best work they ever did. And holy crap, you get some killer fucking songs on here. Tracks like the opening title track, probably the best song of their groove metal period they ever wrote. As, man, killer riffs, chugs, but you still get some thrashy gallops. Let Us Pray, you get like a clean melody with a bass melody, before it almost turns into like a meeting point between thrash and sludge metal. 80 Cycles, back to like more of the Black Sabbath influence, like stoner sludge, but with more crooning vocals. Blitz can croon if he wants to. I Am Fear, big double time fury and gallops with killer bass work. And then Blackline kind of feels like an amalgamation of thrash and classic heavy metal, like a thrashier Iron Maiden to a degree. But not to the level of power metal, I will say. But yeah, the album itself, in terms of that more groove metal, thrash metal hybrid era, best work of that whole run. And that's why it is my number 12. It could go up higher, but again, there's just other albums I enjoyed more. Who knows, maybe if I listen to this more times, it might go up. But for now, it is my number 12. So, not long after Necroshine came out, Joe would be replaced by guitarist Dave Linsk, who will remain in the band to this day, as Dave has been an anchor of the band ever since joining in '99. And eventually, they would retool some stuff, and in 2000, Sebastian Marino would leave the band, and in 2001, they would eventually get Derek Taylor to take over on rhythm guitars. However, Derek would not be on this next album. Sebastian would still be on there, but now working with Dave Linsk. So they would return to the studio in 2000. Once again, we go back to Colin Richardson in the mix. Released October 24th, 2000, this time on Steamhammer Records, as we get a record label shift here. We would get Bloodletting. This one drops to my number 19, my second to last. Again, it's still good. Like I said, there is no bad album in this catalog, but this one definitely just doesn't stand out as much. And actually, I will say, it turns out Sebastian Marino wasn't even on this album. It was just Dave Linsk. So this would be the final album with the band being a four-piece before they would officially get Derek Taylor a year later. But still got some standouts. Thunderheads, a galloping riff farm, tracks like Bleed Me, and hell, even My Name is Pain, both very thrashy. Let It Burn and Left Hand Man, still getting some grooves, but you still get like massive riffs, whether it be in the more galloping sense, groovy sense, or thrashy sense. But again, the snares too fucking small, and the track Blown Away, weird melodies and vocals. Just wasn't really feeling that song. But still, again, good album, but it just doesn't stand out in comparison to a lot of their other works. So that's why it fell to my 19. So we would wait nearly 2.5 years for this next album. So this would be the longest break up to this point in their history in terms of releasing music. And once again, Colin Richardson comes in the mix, but he would also produce this album. And they would also go to Spitfire Records for this next one, and actually for the next couple. And released March 25th, 2003, we get Killbox 13. This one is my number 16 album. I will say it was a bit of an improvement over Bloodletting, and this album was a kind of a brief return to the old era of Overkill. It's a little more thrashy, but you still get some groove metal on here, and to me it just kind of felt like a less inspired version of the old days, but still pretty damn decent. Like, I still think this is a good album, but you still have a lot of groove metal going on here, and again, the snare still doesn't sound great. But you still get, again, really good songs. Damned feels like Anthrax. It feels like an Anthrax song, but with a Slayer breakdown going on. Tracks like No Lights, bringing in more harmonies to the guitars, since this would be Derek Taylor's recording debut, as he and Dave Linsk just work so well together at lead trade-offs and harmonies and melodies. And No Lights was definitely like a first indication of that. The Sound of Dying, great like thrashy downstroke riffs, but still some solid groove metal. Struck Down, galloping riffing and great bass work. And Unholy, this one definitely out of the entire album felt properly like old Overkill. Faster riffing and rhythms, it was just a nasty, ripping song. So this one just kind of felt like a compromise, perhaps, than a comeback, because, like, it's got aspects of the old sound, but it's still not quite there yet. We're a few albums away from that point, but still, again, the snare sucks, but musically it's still pretty good. My number 16. So 2005 comes around, and we would get a follow-up to Killbox 13, as the band would return to the studio at the end of 2004, and released March 22nd, 2005, we get Relics, or Reli 14. Strange album title. But this one, in a discography where the consistency is there, something had to be last, and it was this one. And the biggest reason for why it's last is this might be the worst produced album of their career. Muddy as all get out in the mixing, and again, the snare sucks. Musically, it's still pretty solid. It's still in that groove thrash hybrid era they've been in ever since I Hear Black. Musically is good, but the production, this was just not a good production at all. But still, I got some standouts. Bats in the Belfry. You do get some like chug and nasty riffs before you do get into harmonies. A Pound of Flesh. Short song, sweet to the point, and it's a thrashy barn burner. Same with Keeper. Wheels. very cool, like, groove and chug. And then a novelty song with the track Old School feels more like a punk song, and even features a guest radio read from Eddie Trunk, who most of you may know from That Metal Show, but also being a legendary radio host and DJ for all things metal, and even worked at Megaforce for many years in the 80s. So, and he's a close friend of the band, so he came in to do like a radio read for the album. But yeah, good album, but the production's horrible. Okay, I guess I shouldn't say horrible, but really just not that good. And that's why it's my dead last. But moving ahead to 2007, so 2.5 years go by, and we get another record label change. We go to Bodog Records, which apparently used to be like an online casino entertainment company that created a record label. And so far, Overkill is one of the only bands I saw on that label, so this is kind of an interesting one. But released October 9th, 2007, we get Immortalis. This one goes up to my number 15. This is a big step up from Relix, and this would end up being the final album of this era for sure. And actually, I forgot to mention too that before this album was recorded and after Relix was released, Tim Millar would end up leaving the band to be replaced by Ron Lipnicki, formerly of Whiplash, on drums, and this would be his recording debut. Album song-wise, it's definitely, I would say, more like 60% thrash, 40% groove metal. Like, they're slowly getting back to thrash again. And hell, I would argue this sounds more sinister than most albums they've done up to this point. Production-wise, snare is still not great, and even the lead tone on the guitars was a little squawky. But you still got some killer tracks on here. Devils in the Mist was a great thrashy start. Skull and Bones, big evil riff farm that featured guest vocals from Randy Bly from Lamb of God. And this was just when Lamb of God was blowing up big. Well, I mean, they were already blowing up big, but 2007, they were like one of the biggest bands in the world at this point. And for Randy to come in to do vocals for an old school band kind of brought them more attention, brought Overkill more attention, which is good. Shadow of a Doubt, big evil thrasher with, again, more chugging riffs. Hell Is starts off with an awesome doom riff before it gets into speed territory. And then we get the final song in the Overkill series, Overkill 5, The Brand. Sinister closer with doomy melodies, chug, and thrash metal to the fullest. So this was kind of like a signaling of what was about to happen next for the band, which we're excited to talk about now. But still, this album, really good. My number 15. So, moving along, we go into 2009 for the recording of this next album, and one last record label change. They would end up on Nuclear Blast Records, where they still remain to this day, and thank God for that, man. So, 2009, they would go back to the studio to work on this next album, and for this one, they would actually get some mixing help from a big heavy hitter, Peter Tattergren from Hypocrisy, doing the mixing on this album. Released January 29th, 2010, we would get Ironbound. This is my number 4 album. Welcome back, Overkill. No longer are we toying around with groove metal, even though, like I said, that era still had its gems. Like I said, there is no bad album in the catalog. Even Relix, I still think, is a good album for what it is. But now we're back. We are back to classic, old-school Overkill, but with a modern sound to it. We're back to thrash pretty much through and through. And holy shit, this album might be my favorite production of their entire career. Killer tracks like The Green and Black was a great way to make a statement right out of the gate with a bass melody, dark guitar melodies, into a thick, heavy tone that's about the thickest it's sounded since Years of Decay. And then you get into the title track. Feels almost like Elimination Part 2. It has that energy and that spirit to it, but with a chuggy breakdown and a great somber, clean melody. The Goal Is Your Soul one of my favorite clean melodies of their career, and then it just goes into Rift City. In Vain, maybe the heaviest song of their career, as it starts off with like bordering on death metal triplet chugs. It was nasty, it was massive, and then it gets even faster, like again, German thrash fast. And then Killing for a Living, it just feels like a perfect song to describe their career. It is a killer track to bring it all to a close. Yeah, this was a monumental album, and it really kickstarted their new era they're in, which is the return era for the band that still goes on to this day. Excuse me. But yeah, Ironbound, phenomenal comeback, number 4. So moving on to 2012, where we would get the next album. This time we would start to get mixing help from Greg Reilly. He would be coming in to mix for a little while in the band. Released March 27th, 2012, we would get The Electric Age. This is my number 6. It's definitely continuing on the momentum of Ironbound, and I would say it's almost as good as Ironbound, but you also have Fuel the Fire in between. But this is a perfect follow-up, as it just, again, continuing the momentum that they built with Ironbound and really getting down to the nitty-gritty. I mean, all these songs were great. Come and Get It is a great Furious opener. Electric Rattlesnake, you get like really cool D-beat gallops. It kind of harkens back to the really early days. Rift City, but you do get some like quieter sections to build up atmosphere. Black Days, very much like a triplet chugging, swinging song. And then Drop the Hammer Down and Good Night are both awesome thrashers. So yeah, this album, again, continuing that momentum to the fullest and proving to the thrash kids that, hey, the hardest working band in thrash is still us, damn it. And we're going to keep this momentum going whether you like it or not. My number 6. So moving on from there, we go into 2014. Once again, Greg Reilly doing the mixing for this. And released July 18th, 2014, we would get White Devil Armory. I actually reviewed this album when it came out, and I loved it then, and I love it now. This is my number 8, so definitely does have a slight diminishing returns, but I guess I really shouldn't say that. Just Overkill are just grossly fucking consistent. And they have been super consistent ever since Ironbound. It's just this one, I just don't like as much as the previous two, but still an awesome album. What I will say I appreciate about this album is the production. Like, it gets a little grittier in the recording quality, the tones, and the mix, trying to harken back to a more old school sound as opposed to the more modernized sounds of the previous two albums. But again, awesome songs. Armorist, energetic opener. Bitter Pill, you get clean melodies into just overkill madness. Even atonal melody shows up here with some chugs. Freedom Rings, awesome bass line into just absolute fury. King of the Rat Bastards, that's one of my favorite titles of a song. It's just, again, energetic and gnarly, and then in the name, more triplet chugs and swings going on to just add more heft to everything. So yeah, this is another awesome continuation of their momentum, and it is my number 8. So, moving on from there, we would continue the momentum forward, and they would go back to the studio in late 2016, and released February 10th, 2017, we would get The Grinding Wheel. This is my number 10. So yeah, you notice they do dip in quality on the ranking, but the quality of the albums is still there. This is still another awesome delivery from Overkill. This time, Andy Sneap would mix the album, and you can tell a little bit it's an Andy Sneap mix, but in terms of the recording quality, it doesn't really have an Andy Sneap sound. So I would say this album gets heavier, arguably, than the previous two. Maybe not to the level of Ironbound, but it does get heavier. This was also the longest album of their career at a little over an hour long. And definitely kind of feels like an all-encompassing Overkill album. Like, you do get touches of the old groove metal sound coming back on tracks like Come Heavy, but it's still really killer. But other great tracks like Mean Green Killing Machine, awesome opener that's just fast and ferocious, but does have a really cool like blues swing going on. Goddamn Trouble, it gets even faster. The Long Road, great melodic build into like awesome shredding guitars. Let's All Go to Hades starts off with like an evil doom melody, and then it more or less goes into classic heavy metal territory. And then the title track, basically mixing doom, groove, and thrash into one, into a killer closer to bring this album to a close. So yeah, just continuing momentum, and the album itself was great. My number 10. So, moving on 2 years later, so we're really getting back in the rhythm for sure. And they would go back to the studio in late 2009 or 18 to work on this next album. This time they would get Chris Zeus Harris, mostly known for recording and producing Hatebreed's albums. He would come in to mix this next album, and released February 22nd, 2019, we would get The Wings of War. I also reviewed this one when it came out. This one's my number 11. I would say in terms of the modern era, it's maybe the weakest offering, but to say it's weak is kind of an oxymoron. This is still a damn good killer album for sure. The tones get grittier again, kind of like White Devil Armory. However, I would say songwriting-wise, they get a little bit more streamlined on here. Like the opening Last Man Standing, strange how it starts off with a techno beat, but it does get into heavy riffs and then into balls to the wall riffs. Head of a Pin, Triplet Chugs, Gallops, Evil Melodies, batshit crazy, heavier riffing and some killer like Maiden gallops. Now, I've been needing, and I've talked about this in the review, I believe, but the track Distortion, the opening clean melody, I dare you guys to listen to this opening melody and then listen to the bridge melody on the song Little Julie by Sarcophago. Tell me they don't sound similar, because I think they fucking sound similar, because holy shit, I was blown away at that melody being the way it was. And then it's more or less kind of a groove metal song, but it's still killer. And then Hole in My Soul, dark melodies into thrash insanity, but still retaining melody to it. Like, this is a more melodic thrash song that you would hear in bands like Death Angel, for example. But yeah, another really good album, my number 11. So, moving on, so they play some shows in 2019, and then the pandemic hit in 2020. And this would end up being the longest gap between albums to date, because this album would be delayed quite a few times. They were starting the recording in like 2021, but didn't get it finished until 2023. Released April 14th, 2023, we would get their latest offering, Scorched. This one I also reviewed on the channel, and this is my number 9. I think this album kind of stepped it up a little bit in comparison to the previous two, and with Colin Richardson coming in to help mix the album once again, definitely shows, as production got a little bit bigger than it was on Wings of War. But man, the song still did pack a punch. It almost made my year-end list. It was just an honorable mention because 2023 was such a hell of a year for music. But this is still a great album in its own right. Tracks like the title track, tapping melodies into gallops, riffs, breakdowns, and even blast beats coming in. And I completely forgot to mention, too, that prior to Wings of War, Ron Lipnicki would be replaced by Jason Bittner from Shadows Fall on drums, so he played on Wings of War and Scorched. And of course, I'm a big Jason Bittner fan, so that's definitely a plus. But yeah, he did a killer job on both albums. But yeah, bringing in blast beats into Overkill songs was something out of the ordinary, like on the title track and Twist of the Wick, thrashy blast beats. And then Going Home, thrashy insanity. know her name. You get some great like downstroke riffs. And then Bag o' Bones is a fun closer with gallops and groove. Almost like you could booty shake and headbang at the same time. And the song itself definitely feels appropriate for Halloween, so this is a perfect time to talk about it again when we're at Halloween time. So, yeah, longest gap in between, which was over 4 years, but still, the album itself was killer. Honestly, if I could redo my year-end list, it probably should have been on there, but still, it was a tough year to rank albums that year, but still, this album was fucking fantastic, and I can't wait for what's going to happen next. But for now, this album is my number 9. So, as far as what's going on with the band now, last year in 2024, Jason Bittner would leave the band to focus primarily on Shadows Fall, and now we got Jeremy Kling from Inhuman Condition on drums, and remains in the band as of right now. So, what is the legacy of Overkill? The legacy of Overkill is of not only the most consistent and hardworking thrash band of all time, but one of the most consistent and hardworking bands in the history of heavy metal. No matter what they did, whether it was staying true to their thrash roots while still being in the groove metal bug in the 90s and the 2000s, or the thrash sounds of the 80s and where we've been in the last 15 years with the band just continues to pump out quality release after quality release and never made a bad album. Everything's been good to classic, and no signs of this band slowing down at all. Long live and all hail Overkill. But of course, that's going to do it for this ranking. So what are your guys' rankings? Your favorite, least favorite Overkill albums? Let me know in the comments below. There is one final ranking to do before the end of the year. This December, I'm going to be ranking all albums from Norwegian black metal legends Shooter. That shouldn't take nearly as long to get through since it's a short discography, but that's going to be the ranking I'm doing in December, so hopefully you'll tune into that. But until next time, thank you for watching, keep your horns high, and your dreams wet.